When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June the 22nd, 1941, his strategic gaze was primarily fixed on the fertile agricultural lands of Ukraine, the industrial hubs of the Donbass, and the political heart of Moscow. However, on the northernmost fringe of the European continent lay a strategic prize that would quietly dictate the long-term survival of the Soviet state: the ice-free port of Murmansk. Located on the Kola Peninsula, deep within the Arctic Circle, Murmansk was a geographical anomaly. While the northern Soviet ports of Archangel and Onega froze solid for nearly half the year, Murmansk remained open to year-round maritime traffic due to the warm waters of the North Atlantic Drift, a branch of the Gulf Stream. This unique hydrographic feature transformed Murmansk from a desolate northern outpost into an indispensable geopolitical gateway, a vital umbilical cord connecting the highly centralized Soviet command economy to the industrial and financial power of Great Britain and the United States. The strategic significance of this northern corridor became immediately apparent to both Allied and Soviet planners in the opening weeks of the German invasion. As the Wehrmacht's panzer groups tore through the Baltic states and encircled Soviet armies in Belarus, the Soviet Union faced a catastrophic collapse of its industrial capacity. Entire aircraft, tank and munitions factories had to be dismantled and loaded onto rail cars to be evacuated eastward to the Urals, leaving a massive, highly dangerous gap in Soviet military production that could not be filled for at least 6 to 9 months. To bridge this critical production void, the Soviet Union required immediate, massive infusions of high-grade raw materials, refined petroleum, specialized machinery, and finished weapons. This assistance could only be provided by the Western Allies, and the fastest, most direct route to deliver this aid was the Arctic Run, which departed from ports in Iceland and Scotland, navigated around the northern tip of occupied Norway, and docked at Murmansk and Archangel. For the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Arctic convoy route was not merely a diplomatic gesture of solidarity, but an urgent strategic necessity to keep the Red Army in the fight, thereby pinning down the vast majority of German ground forces and preventing them from turning their full attention back toward the west. For the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, Murmansk was a lifeline that had to be defended at all costs. The port was linked to Leningrad and the industrial centers of central Russia by the Murmansk Railway, a single-track line constructed under brutal conditions during the First World War. This railway represented the critical transport link through which Allied Lend-Lease material could be funneled directly to the front lines. If the German army could sever this railway or capture Murmansk, they would not merely take a remote city. They would sever the shortest and most efficient supply route between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, isolating the USSR and depriving it of the vital equipment needed to sustain its colossal, high-attrition defensive campaigns. To secure the Arctic flank and neutralize the strategic threat of Murmansk, the German High Command developed Operation Silver Fox, Unternehmen Silberfuchs, a multi-pronged offensive designed to capture the Soviet port and sever the Kola Peninsula from the rest of the Soviet Union. The overall operation was placed under the command of General Nicholas von Falkenhorst, the head of German forces in Norway, and was divided into 3 distinct operational phases: Operation Reindeer, Unternehmen Rentier, Operation Platinum Fox, Unternehmen Platinfuchs, and Operation Arctic Fox, Unternehmen Polarfuchs. The central spearhead of this Arctic campaign was Operation Platinum Fox, an assault launched from the newly occupied Norwegian territory of Kirkenes directly toward Murmansk. This spearhead was entrusted to the elite mountain corps Norway, Gebirgsjã Norwegian, commanded by the legendary General Eduard Dietl, the hero of the Battle of Narvik. Dietl's force consisted of the 2nd and 3rd Mountain Divisions, comprised of highly trained specialized Alpine troops who had spent years training in the mountains of Austria and Bavaria. However, despite their elite status, these mountain troops were utterly unprepared for the unique and terrifying geographical realities of the sub-Arctic tundra. The German High Command's intelligence on the Kola Peninsula was catastrophically deficient, relying on outdated and highly inaccurate Finnish maps that depicted a relatively flat, forested landscape intersected by minor dirt roads. In reality, the terrain between Kirkenes and Murmansk was a chaotic, trackless wilderness of solid granite rocks, vast fields of jagged boulders, deep bogs, and freezing glacial lakes. There were absolutely no roads, no railways, and no natural landmarks to guide the advancing troops. Furthermore, the Finnish-German alliance in the north was a complex, fragile arrangement. While the Finnish forces under Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim were highly motivated to reclaim the territories lost to the Soviet Union during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, Mannerheim was deeply cautious about committing Finnish troops to offensive operations that went beyond Finland's pre-war borders. Finnish forces operating on the southern flank of the Arctic offensive under Operation Arctic Fox were tasked with capturing the Soviet rail junction at Kandalaksha to cut the Murmansk railway. However, these forces quickly found themselves bogged down in the dense forests and trackless swamps of the Sala region, where the Red Army had established dense, deeply echeloned defensive networks. This left Dietl's mountain troops to face the primary isolated burden of marching across 90 kilometers of open hostile tundra to reach Murmansk, an operational task that would push the elite Alpine division to the absolute limits of human endurance. When General Dietl's mountain divisions crossed to the Soviet-Norwegian border on June the 29th, 1941, they immediately collided with a logistical nightmare that quickly ground their operational momentum to a complete halt. The German advance was crippled by the absolute physical impossibility of maintaining a functional supply line over the pathless granite tundra. Within days of crossing the border, the heavy wheeled vehicles of the division's supply trains became hopelessly wedged between giant boulders or sunk up to their axles in deep peat moss bogs. This forced the mountain divisions to rely entirely on pack mules, which had been brought all the way from the Mediterranean, and small local herds of reindeer. However, these pack animals could carry only a fraction of the ammunition, food, and heavy artillery shells required to sustain an offensive against a fortified enemy, and the rough granite rocks quickly tore the hooves and legs of the mules, rendering hundreds of them useless. By the time the German mountain troops reached the Titovka River and then pushed forward to the Litsa River, just 45 kilometers from Murmansk, they were operating on starvation rations and suffering from severe physical exhaustion. It was on the banks of the Litsa River that the Soviet Red Army, specifically the 52nd Rifle Division, reinforced by thousands of fanatical Soviet naval infantry from the Northern Fleet and local civilian militias, established a formidable, unyielding defensive line. The Soviet defenders utilized the rocky ridges and deep ravines to construct elaborate stone bunkers and interlocking machine gun nests that were virtually impervious to light mortar fire. Because the Germans had been unable to transport their heavy 15-center field howitzers across the pathless tundra, Dietl's infantry was forced to charge these stone fortresses with little to no artillery support. To make matters worse, the Soviet Northern Fleet, operating with absolute naval superiority in the Barents Sea, executed several highly effective surprise amphibious landings behind the German left flank. These amphibious raids constantly threatened to cut the single primitive supply track that the German construction battalions, Organisation Todt, were desperately trying to build over the granite rocks, forcing Dietl to repeatedly divert whole battalions from the frontline assault to defend his rear. As the short sub-Arctic summer gave way to the freezing autumn winds and blinding blizzards of October, the German offensive spent its final energy in a series of desperate, bloody assaults across the Litsa River. Having suffered over 10,000 casualties, with no hope of reinforcements or winter clothing, Dietl was forced to accept that his mountain corps had reached the limit of its physical capacity, and the Arctic front solidified into a frozen, static war of position that would remain virtually unchanged for the next 3 years. While German mountain troops lay frozen in their stone trenches along the Litsa River, the port of Murmansk was rapidly transforming into a massive, highly efficient industrial conduit that would reshape the balance of power on the Eastern Front. The first Allied convoy, code-named Dervish, arrived in Archangel on August 31st, 1941, carrying 15 Hawker Hurricane fighters and raw rubber. However, as the northern seas froze, the bulk of the maritime traffic shifted to the year-round port of Murmansk. Between 1941 and 1945, the Arctic convoys delivered over 4 million tons of cargo to the Soviet Union, representing approximately 23% of the total Lend-Lease aid sent to the USSR. This aid was not merely a drop in the ocean. It was highly concentrated in critical technological bottlenecks that the Soviet Union's war economy was completely unable to address due to the evacuation of its factories. The most vital portion of this Lend-Lease cargo was not finished tanks or aircraft, but logistical and industrial infrastructure. The Western Allies delivered hundreds of thousands of Studebaker 2.5-ton trucks, which provided the Red Army with unprecedented motorized mobility, allowing them to rapidly move troops and supply artillery during their massive strategic counter-offensives. Furthermore, the Allies supplied nearly 2,000 steam locomotives and over 11,000 railway cars, along with millions of tons of steel rails and high-tensile copper wire. This massive railway injection kept the Soviet rail network, the absolute backbone of its war effort, from collapsing under the weight of the massive troop movements. Additionally, the Arctic route delivered millions of tons of high-octane aviation fuel, aluminum, essential for aircraft construction, and explosives like TNT, which were blended with Soviet domestic powder to increase the destructive power of Soviet artillery shells. To transport this mountain of steel and fuel from the docks of Murmansk to the Central Front, the Soviets relied entirely on the Murmansk Railway. Stretching over 1,000 kilometers through the dense Karelian forests to Leningrad and Vologda, the railway was a prime target for the German Luftwaffe's Luftflotte 5, based in northern Norway and Finland. Throughout 1941 and 1942, German bombers flew thousands of sorties, dropping high-explosive bombs on the bridges, water towers, and rail junctions of the line. Yet the Soviet response was a masterpiece of organizational resilience. The Red Army deployed specialized railway construction brigades and thousands of local civilian laborers along the entire length of the track. When German bombers destroyed a section of track or a bridge, these repair teams, working in freezing mud and sub-zero temperatures, would rebuild the line in a matter of hours, often laying down temporary wooden trestle bridges while the smoke was still clearing. This unyielding physical determination ensured that the flow of Lend-Lease material from the Murmansk docks was never permanently interrupted, allowing the industrial power of the Western Allies to flow directly into the veins of the Red Army at its most vulnerable moment. The failure of Operation Silver Fox was not merely a localized operational disappointment, it was a strategic failure of the highest order that directly preserved the Soviet Union's structural capacity to survive the German onslaught. If the German High Command had possessed the strategic foresight to recognize the true geopolitical value of Murmansk in early 1941, and had committed the necessary division strength reinforcements and heavy engineering equipment to secure the port, the cascading consequences would have severely deformed the Soviet war effort. A successful German capture of Murmansk and the permanent severing of the Murmansk Railway in the summer of 1941 would have closed the northern Lend-Lease gateway at the very moment when the Soviet Union was at its absolute nadir. This would have forced all Allied maritime aid to be rerouted through the long, logistically immature Persian corridor or the dangerous, low-capacity Pacific route to Vladivostok, delaying the arrival of vital materials by several critical months. The immediate operational impact of this Arctic severance would have been felt most acutely during the Battle of Moscow in October and November 1941. It is a highly significant, often neglected historical fact that during the critical defensive phase of Operation Typhoon, British-supplied Matilda and Valentine tanks made up between 30 and 40% of the total medium and heavy tank strength of the Soviet armies defending the capital. These tanks, delivered directly via the Arctic ports and rushed south down the Murmansk Railway, provided the Red Army with a crucial steel shield at a time when Soviet domestic tank production had virtually ceased due to factory evacuations. Without this rapid northern influx of British armour and the Hawker Hurricane fighters that helped secure the airspace over the Kremlin, the Soviet defensive lines before Moscow may well have fractured, leading to the encirclement of the capital and the collapse of Stalin's central command apparatus. Furthermore, the loss of the Murmansk rail link would have sealed the fate of besieged Leningrad. Deprived of the ability to receive supplies or evacuate civilians via the northern railway networks, and with the Lake Ladoga ice road, the road of life, vulnerable to increased German air and artillery pressure from a secured northern sector, the city of Leningrad would have suffered a rapid, total starvation. The collapse of Leningrad would have freed up the entire German 18th Army and the Finnish forces under Mannerheim, allowing them to swing south to reinforce Army Group Center for a decisive, irresistible push into the Soviet interior. By failing to secure the Arctic gateway, Hitler permitted the Western Allies to continuously pump high-technology steel, fuel, and rubber directly into the heart of the Soviet military machine, demonstrating that the remote tundra of the Kola Peninsula was, in reality, the vital pivot upon which the entire global conflict turned. In the final analysis, the battle for Murmansk and the failure of Operation Silver Fox in 1941 represent one of the most critical, yet frequently underestimated, strategic turning points of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. The campaign demonstrates the absolute primacy of logistics, infrastructure, and raw material transport over raw tactical skill or localized military doctrine. While German mountain troops possessed superior tactical training and a stellar operational record in Western Europe, they were fundamentally defeated by the absolute physical constraints of the subarctic geography and the complete failure of the German High Command to supply and engineer a functional line of communication over the pathless granite tundra. This logistical vacuum allowed the Soviet Union, through sheer organizational resilience and a massive continuous mobilization of civilian labor, to maintain the vital Kirov Railway and transform Murmansk into an impregnable industrial citadel that constantly fed the Red Army with high-tensile steel, high-octane fuel, motorized transport, and essential raw materials. The historiography of the Eastern Front has slowly evolved to recognize that the Allied victory was not solely a product of Soviet demographic masses or German weather excuses, but a highly complex, globally integrated coalition effort that relied on the continuous, uninterrupted flow of high-technology materials across the oceans. By successfully holding the Litsa river line and keeping the Arctic gateway open, the Red Army did not just win a localized defensive victory in the freezing tundra. They preserved the structural, material foundation of the entire Grand Alliance. The steel rails of the Murmansk Railway and the warm waters of the Kola Inlet were the literal and figurative conduits through which the industrial might of the Western democracies was fused with the unyielding manpower of the Soviet state, forging the unstoppable mechanical engine that would ultimately crush the Third Reich under a mountain of Allied metal.